Jack Murdock was a person who valued innovation and creativity. He sought to encourage the entrepreneurial spirit, which would lead to technological advances as well as advances in the way people work together.
Jack Murdock, a life well lived. An only child of his mother May and his father Leslie Murdock, Melvin Jack Murdock was born in Portland, Oregon in 1917. Jack shares a little of his childhood experience in these excerpts from his autobiography written as a student while attending this Franklin High School campus in southeast Portland.
16 years ago, on August the 15th, I came into the world. The first 2 weeks of my life were spent at the Good Samaritan Hospital in Portland, Oregon, during which time my proud parents were overflowing with joy. My first home was a large 2-story house located 1 block north of Foster Road and 55th Street. At the very early age of 2, I made a trip with my parents to Nebraska for a visit to my many relatives. At my grandma's house was a phonograph that I enjoyed playing greatly. In addition to my regular studies, I was privileged to be the school electrician and took a leading part in most of the school programs. It was at this time that I first spoke over a radio station. After leaving high school and establishing a business of my own, I intend to go further into the study of radio phenomena. I would like to learn all there is to know about radio if it is possible. If I do all that I hope to do, I shall probably make some inventions. I have at present several ideas for inventions, which if put into use would be of great benefit to the people of the world.
After graduating from high school, Jack's parents offered him some money and 2 options. Jack could use the money either to begin his college studies or to open his own business. Jack chose the business route.
Jack received money from his dad to start the retail store rather than going on to a university.
Still a teenager in a country struggling to recover from the Great Depression, Jack opened a retail shop selling his beloved radios as well as appliances. He soon met Howard Vollum, a young radio technician and engineering graduate from Reed College, and the two decided that Howard would work from Jack's shop, providing service and repair.
I'd heard about Jack a number of times and what a nice operation he had, so I went out to see him.
But he was really good with customers, and he was really a very personable man.
This pleasant arrangement came to a close as World War II beckoned. Howard's expertise landed him in the Army Signal Corps working on radar technology far away in England, while Jack served in radio operations for the Coast Guard much closer to home in Washington State. It was in the Coast Guard that Jack connected with a fellow serviceman, Miles Tippery, who prior to the war had owned his own radio shop in Castle Rock, Washington.
Well, my dad, Miles, and Jack met in the Coast Guard, and they worked well together. I think they enjoyed doing some of the field repairs together. My dad spoke of Jack's expertise, is willing to read the manual and figure out how things were done from a technological perspective. My dad really respected that.
And both of them were able to get into the radio department right away without going to training, which was nice.
When they were starting to think about what they wanted to do after World War II, after their stint in the Coast Guard was up, and they had these long conversations about, what kind of a business would they like to do, and they both had the same background with selling radios and repairing radios of the era, of the 30s era. And they knew they wanted to be in a more technical field because in the Coast Guard they were exposed to all kinds of new technology, and they were really on the cusp, the cutting edge of this new technology that was developed. Of course, the name of Howard Vollum came up.
When my father was in the Channel Islands in the Army Signal Corps, he was working on artillery tracking radar. And one of the people that was in my dad's group was Dave Packard. And Dave Packard, as the war ended, said to Howard, you know, you're a really sharp guy, I'd like to hire you, come work in my company. And Howard said, no, I have an idea for a business and I have a business partner picked out. Hewlett Packard was not a big company, but it had already had its first successes. It really reflects back to the fact that Howard and Jack wanted to work together.
They were not just individuals out there that did this great thing. It was how these guys worked together. What's good about Murdock is his ability to put people together and see their strengths. But Murdock was the glue that kind of pulled everybody together.
While both Jack and Miles Tippery were quite accomplished in their study of electronics, it was Howard Volham's engineering capabilities that would be central to their first product.
Howard had this instrument that they called an oscilloscope, which he had started developing. We went to a trade show in San Francisco. Every other company built the oscilloscopes he built were about 400 pounds and tremendously big.
Early cathode ray oscillographs were large, bulky instruments nearly 8 feet tall.
They were gigantic, a whole bench top full of stuff. And Howard's belief was that he can make something that was probably this wide and about this tall, and it was a 5-inch screen, and it was called the 511.
Howard's first attempt was far more accurate than the competition, but too big and heavy. Jack brought in another Coast Guard buddy, a very bright machinist named Milt Bave. Milt and Howard went back to the workbench. 1 year later, weighing in at just 50 pounds, the 511 scope was ready to go. The oscilloscope was a key building block for all future electronics, a field burgeoning after the war. From radio and TV to an EKG in healthcare, to computers and even the space program. This small group of 20-somethings had caught a tiger by the tail.
Our instruments are prominent in the United States' efforts to probe outer space. Tracking stations in the United States space program use Tektronix oscilloscopes. An oscilloscope can record the reactions of a patient in surgery. It can monitor the heartbeat of man or machine. It can measure any phenomena that can be converted to electrical signals, light, sound, pressure, gravity, a nerve impulse, or the thrust of a jet engine.
They started increasing in size right away. The Hawthorne plant, it was very crowded, very small. When they moved into the new building, it kind of looked overwhelming for a while, but it wasn't long, and it was really filled in. I was the 119th employee. I was not a very technical person, and I kept thinking to myself, all those instruments, you know, they'd ship 500 this month, 1,000 the next month, you know, and more, and I'd say to my wife, I'd say, oh, you know, they're going to load the industry, and, you know, there won't be any, won't need it anymore. What are we going to do then?
By the time we built the new building on Sunset, we had, I don't know, about 500 people and no union.
Back when we're talking now in the 1960s, the word Tektronix was magic because it was the future.
We'll continue to supply the tools that man may better know the world about him, and will continue to assist in man's quest to know the unknown.
We had in the order of 4,000 to 5,000 employees at that time that I joined, and maybe a little bit less, but we had 3,500 enrollees in our educational process. So personal education was a significant component to Jack's vision for the company.
He wanted to run Tektronix so that no union could ever get a foothold in there. He said that ought to be possible because management ought to be able to treat their people in a way that they would lose if they went with a union. You know, there ought to be some way to harness a person's natural rhythms, enthusiasms, and creativity so that work is a joy even though somebody else owns the company. And I think that was why he was so interested in the Menninger Foundation.
Just as Howard was innovating in the lab, Jack was innovating management ideas. Jack, who had always been so fascinated with taking radios apart and putting them back together again, was now learning about the human psyche and how to take apart the paradigms that were deeply ingrained in the business culture of his era and rebuilding them in a revolutionary new way. Jack's initiatives were virtually unheard of among his contemporaries. His ways of treating people inspired a sense of community and helped create a hotbed of innovation that elevated Tektronix from his parents' basement to an international business that would for a time be the largest private employer in the state of Oregon.
If we ask our people for their ideas on just what is the Tektronix spirit, they are likely to answer, oh, it's working together, it's playing together, it's thinking together, it's helping each other. I guess you might say it's sharing.
So he looked at technological advances like computers, which were just sort of entering the stream in the late 50s and 60s. He looked at those as really opportunities to help mankind reach their full potential.
To be the best manager he could be, to be the best motivator and supporter of this fast-growing team of employees, Jack delved into what was considered the nation's top think tank on all things psychiatric, the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas.
William Menninger was the head of all psychiatry in the Army during World War II. And if there's anybody who knew how screwed up institutions can get in a hurry, it was Will Menninger. And he came back prepared to devote the rest of his life to helping large corporations.
Some of you know I've served on the board of the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas for the last 8 or 9 years, and I hear a few of the pros talk about some of these things from time to time. At Menninger's, much research has taken place, as it has across the country, regarding the nature of man, his personality, what helps him develop into constructive, effective activities, and what things keep him from doing constructive things.
Menninger, whom Time magazine considered one of the most outstanding integrators of faith and psychiatry, considered psychiatry a combination of the best of social science, blended with an attitude of love.
I don't think he looked at things as some entrepreneurs and businessmen do, that it's business opportunities. I think he felt that it was an opportunity to help society and help individuals along the way and help society at large and in general. We had cafeterias located throughout our buildings, and we never bothered with cashiers. We would put an open cash box, which was part of Jack's legacy, and people would come, and if they didn't have the money that day for lunch, they put in an IOU, and then payday would come, and they would pay for it, and the system, aside from saving, the cost of a cashier, we always had more money in our receipts than we were intended to do, because if something was 80 cents and they had $1, they just throw in the $1.
Every now and then, if you didn't have money, then you kind of looked sheepishly and didn't put any in, and the next day you put back in what was there, because that was a huge part of the environment and the trust.
We never had any starting or stopping times. Obviously that we had a window of time, but no time clocks or anything like that.
He would say, how do we capture human motivation? That was like a burning question to him, and it came up again and again and again. And he would work with that different ways, like, well, perhaps if you're a night person and not a morning person, we ought to tolerate you coming in at 10 or 12 and working later, or just setting your own schedule.
That kind of freedom liberated creative talent in individuals far beyond one could imagine. And as a result of that, when you don't constrain people to a task, but give them the opportunity to think beyond that task, many felt that they had inventions or opportunities to contribute differently in the environment, and Tektronix encouraged that.
And I also got my first profit-sharing check, and that was a big deal for me because I had that same visceral reaction that somebody thinks enough of what I'm doing to give me this check.
Howard Vollum and Jack Murdock did not start out to make a lot of money. They started out to make a better oscilloscope. That's what had to be in their hearts and their minds, that there is a better way. And that's the reason I think that the profit share was so generous. They wanted to give it back to those who made it all happen.
Jack Murdock was an Oregon legend. And when they founded Tektronix, that was one of the biggest things that's ever happened in Oregon. They were the model organization for what they did for their people and the very high regard that all of their employees had for their owners.
He always had a high degree of interest in what you were doing and in your own personal life, and once he met you, he never forgot you.
He was a great listener, and as a result, people shared with him many things that they wouldn't share with others. And as a result of that, Jack helped an awful lot of people individually.
He always knew when we needed to have a talk. He was always very curious in what I was doing, and he asked lots of interesting questions. And then typically something interesting would happen shortly thereafter. At one point, I told him of my interest in music, and shortly thereafter, he showed up with a bunch of old components, old hi-fi components that he had apparently had stashed in some attic. Counter to Jack's general frugality and desire to remain inconspicuous, he did eventually buy this beautiful home on the Vancouver side of the Columbia River. It was originally white, but that soon changed.
Having dinner together at Salty's, which is on the other side of the river. And he seemed rather preoccupied. He kept looking across the river and looking. And finally, he pointed out his new house, which was painted white. And he said it looked too big. And so we painted it green.
He had a home on the bank of the Columbia River here in Vancouver. It overlooked the river, and I felt quite honored to be invited there a few times.
Jack is a big swimmer. He swam all the time. It was his primary source of exercise, and so he always had a pool. He had to put the pool down a hill. So to get to the swimming pool, you had to take an elevator down, and then there was this long corrugated steel tunnel that took you out to the pool. And my sisters and I would take turns standing at one end, turning the lights on and off, and then we would go down the tunnel to the pool. Jack thought that was pretty funny.
Jack had a party down at his swimming pool and then back in the house for dinner. We flew in that day and then took the people up for rides. I took them up for rides around his pool and around the area.
Tech had gotten so big, it grew so big so fast, that it was difficult to locate a physical site where you could get all the employees and families. And so Tech would take over Jansen Beach for a day on a weekend, usually in the summer, and everybody was there. I remember Jack and my dad walking around Jansen Beach, just shaking hands and just seeing all these folks, and that was really important to them.
I was struck by the number of people who, when we pulled up at a red light, would lean out of their car window and say, "Hi, Jack." And I said to him, "What's that all about?" He said, "I run an institution that has 3,000 people in it. The odds are very good that a lot of people riding up and down this street know me."
They certainly, just took off. And it was the first company that our firm took public in the state of Oregon, the first publicly owned company in Oregon.
I was there in the floor of the stock exchange when they came on the stock exchange. Well, it was just exciting to watch the ticker tape. That day on the stock exchange, and here comes Tech across ticker tape, and it was going up and up and up, and it was very exciting.
Tektronix had a huge impact on the northwest region of the country. As the first high-tech company, they broadened the economic base that previously was so reliant on the timber industry. This map demonstrates how Tech, and eventually Intel, seeded an entire silicon forest of high-tech companies.
Entrepreneurial companies that have grown out of what were people who worked at Tech. It's really quite amazing.
Despite the rocketing success of Tektronix, Jack maintained a very close relationship with his mother and other family members.
I was 12 when my dad died, and it was at that point really that Uncle Jack kind of stepped forward and really kind of became the, kind of the father figure. We filled a niche for each other, especially on Thanksgiving and Christmas when you really want a close family nearby. And we needed someone to sit at the head of the table. And so he was happy to fill that role for us. It was great, and we loved Uncle Jack.
Jack attended all the family get-togethers. He was very family orientated. He was taking a lot of his aunts on a plane ride. Here's one of Jack and his mother. Always called his mother to make sure she was doing all right, and he went over to visit her quite often.
There was more to Jack than Tektronix.
We knew he had interesting hobbies. We knew that he was a big fan of organ music, for example, and had a huge Rogers organ in his home, which he played, and which we thought was amazing. He had a lot of interest in ice skating, figure skating. So I went to the Lloyd Center rink with him a couple of times. He made music tapes. And, to this day, I'm an ice skating fan.
He was going to show me how to skate backwards, and so I tried it, and I turned around, and all of a sudden I went backwards, and boy, I hit my head pretty hard on the ice, too, and it kind of shook me a little bit, and he picked me up.
Another thing that Jack introduced me to is aviation. His Vancouver office was at Pearson Air Park. Every once in a while, Jack would need to go over to Hillsborough for some purpose, or just to take a flight around the pattern, and he'd say, "You want to come?" And oh boy, do I! And I became a pilot subsequent to that.
It was a kind of a one-track mind. He liked to talk airplanes. I just loved to talk airplanes with him.
He wasn't a bowler, so the first 3 balls went in the gutter. And Jack, if you're around Jack, you're just geared down because he didn't move fast, he didn't talk fast, he didn't respond fast. He was very thoughtful in everything that he did. So he would stand there with that bowling ball and stare at the end of the lane and stare. And then finally he would bowl. Anyway, about the last 3, I don't hold me to how many it is, but we're strikes. He was a good study.
And he also enjoyed snow skiing. And so he invented the ski pod so he could put that under the wings of the airplane and to put his skis in to go skiing up on the mountain.
We had a great weekend fishing, and everything was terrific. And there's one thing, and Dan and I, he was on that trip as well, my brother, we talked about this. One of the most memorable things of Jack was we're out bringing fish in, cleaning the fish, and we look up and here's Jack on the dock wearing his coat and tie in Canada, getting ready to help us clean fish. And it was so indelibly etched. He was a kind of a coat and tie fellow, always proper, but always fun. And that was just an amazing weekend.
Well, of course, photography was one major thing. We used to go to the mountains, and he would be interested in wildflowers and know the names and interested in the mountain.
On May 16, 1971, at the age of 53, the unthinkable happened. With the intention of returning from a day trip up the Columbia Gorge, Jack was attempting liftoff from the river in his seaplane. Fierce winds caused the plane to flip on its back. After hanging on to the bobbing plane, hoping in vain to be seen and rescued, he and his passenger started to swim for shore. She made it safely. Jack did not.
This was his partner and his best friend, and it was a very difficult time.
It was just very unfortunate because he still had lots of work to do. He was it was a loss to mankind.
I think it was, for those of us who knew Jack and were related with him in some way or another, it was a moment of great sorrow and sadness.
Disbelief after knowing him and talking to him a few days before, and he was a healthy, vivacious guy, and all of a sudden he's gone. It's hard to believe it when that happens. It's somebody that's outgoing and healthy and a good friend. Actually, the Murdock Foundation is really an extension of Jack's personality. If he could come see how things have evolved, he would really, I think, enjoy and appreciate that which has been accomplished by the Murdock Foundation.
Nobody knew Jack's interest better than the three founding trustees. I had the good fortune of serving with two of the founding trustees for a number of years, so I got to know them quite well, and through that I got to know more about Jack and how he thought.
Jack Murdock would be very pleased with the work that the Murdock Trust is doing today and has been doing for all these years.
I applaud the Murdock Foundation trustees for continuing to fund programs that Jack would have been interested in. That after all, that's really an extension of his life and the things that he would want to do if he were alive.
I tend to look at the Pacific Northwest, the whole realm of the Murdock Trust, and see literally hundreds of organizations across the board, from the arts to the sciences, and see the hand, the interest, the eye, the passions of Jack Murdock. And so I say that in some respects, Jack is still very much with us.
I don't want this to sound trite, because it was so important that they were really the best of what America produced out of World War II. They had a vision for, if we work together, we can produce a product that's good. And it wasn't just about producing things, it was about helping science and technology for other people to lead better lives, or for the country to be stronger and protect our freedoms more.
Jack Murdock was a man who valued the individual, and he valued the community in which he lived. He very much wanted to develop the gifts that he saw around him in others and in the region in which he lived.
Jack Murdock was an individual that valued the American democratic freedoms. He had seen the great advances that this country had made and the great possibilities that it could advance in the contributions for the world and the good of people.